So welcome everyone to the Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of Ecopsychology's luminaries. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Linda Bazell and I co-created this program. Today, we're going to have a conversation about unpsychology, mind, context, ecology with Steve Thorp. A little bit about Steve. Steve is a UK-based therapist, teacher, and writer. He edits Unpsychology magazine with his co-editor, Julia Macintosh. Steve is involved with the Climate Psychology Alliance in the UK and has recently undertaken training as a warm data host with Nora Bateson. He is the author of and collaborator on a number of books of poetry, art, and prose. Welcome, Steve. Thank you for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. Did I miss anything on that brief bio?
No, I think that covers it.
Well, super.
It's really lovely to be here. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So, Steve, I'm just curious about, can you tell the story of how you came up with the concept of unpsychology?
So we go back to about 2012, 13, and in the UK at the time, there was a little movement called the Dark Mountain Project. Some of you might be aware of it more broadly. And now it's runs mainly as a book publishing outlet. But at that time, they ran festivals, little mini festivals around the country in the UK. And I'd got involved with that quite early on. So I think there was 4 festivals they ran, and I went to the last 3, and it was a really interesting environment because I was used to festivals of a kind and conferences of a kind, but this was a space which seemed to be, on the one hand, it was quite doomy in the sense that the basic premise of Dark Mountain was planning for collapse. At the same time, it was a really lovely space, and people were very friendly and happy, and while they were there, there was a real collective feel around those gatherings, and so I looked forward to those really very much over that 3 years, and there was 3 years, and there was a group of people who became friends and colleagues, and people who actually are still working in the area, in the field, and so those events were called uncivilization. So that's where the un comes from. So the Dark Mountain Project had this uncivilization, the Uncivilization Manifesto. Some of you will have come across that, which was the beginnings of unpsychology and the beginnings of the Dark Mountain Project. And so I was working with some of these themes of what would it be like to question some of the assumptions that we have about psychology, not all of them, and not, to broaden out our minds to take in ecology of mind, to take in a kind of a soulful approach to psychology, to see that as lying alongside the social development side of psychology, which is pretty well the mainstream, if you like. And again, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but actually seeing these things as integral. I didn't come at that time from an eco-psychology background, so I was coming at it from a place where I was a practicing psychotherapist and kind of saw it in the field, really, saw it in my consulting rooms, saw it with the people I was talking with, and that was what drew me to the Dark Mountain Project as being a place where I might find like-minded people. And I'm always interested in psychology which doesn't come from psychologists, people who aren't necessarily professional psychologists, people who are artists and coaches and writers and teachers and a whole range of anything, really. And they bring a kind of a soul-making wisdom to their work, which doesn't necessarily have to be a professional, doesn't seem to me to have to be a professional therapy process. Some of the best, if you like, therapists in inverted commas are not therapists. They're people who have those that sort of integral awareness and that ability to really get into that space. So that was where I had been for a while individually, and I kind of hadn't really found a community or a bunch of people who I wanted to share that with. The therapy world in the UK is quite narrow in that way. It doesn't really, or hasn't really, broadened out into issues-based stuff, which I would consider to be integral for any therapist. But actually, it seemed, even just recently, the Black Lives Matter movement has kind of triggered off quite a conversation within the therapeutic community. But I mean, that's like 2020. These were issues which were current in the 1970s and 80s in the UK, and some of us were looking at those then. So it feels like it felt like the therapy environment was quite a conservative one with a small c. So going into the space on the third of those gatherings, I'd offered a workshop which around those themes, around what would it be like if we question some of those assumptions or psychological assumptions, but also most importantly put them in the context of where we were at that time and where we are more this time. So we're talking about the context of climate breakdown in particular, but all the related issues that ecopsychology looks at, which weren't being looked at. And so I put on a session on a Sunday morning, and we had these gatherings in a field, and people would camp, and there was tents around and that sort of thing. And so somebody had hoisted a parachute in the trees, and that morning, it was a Sunday morning, about 10:30 in the morning, and the light was just dappling through. It's just a wonderful feel to it. And about 70 people turned up for this session, or something in that region. It was just, I thought, wow, because I thought maybe 10, 20 or something like that, the normal sort of workshop-y type of group. And we went through this session, which I'd overran and had a lot of engagement, and people seemed to really get into the ideas around the self being much broader than a self that psychology, or they in their common sense cultural way had brought, that we all bring sometimes, this linear approach of determinism, and people seem to really want that breadth and out of that came some conversations. So I had a conversation with Kai Hawksmoor, who's a writer, and at that time was kind of bringing together a kind of an eco-psychological approach. And we talked, and we decided that what would be a good idea is to put something together and to put something out. And that's where Unpsychology magazine, the first one, came out of. And so Kai and myself edited the first two, and we did them in print at first. And I still love those little print versions, but they print magazines, unless you've got distribution and you've got a bit of money, it isn't a particularly good thing to do. So we would sell a small number through fairs and events and that sort of thing, but it wasn't really it wasn't going to be something that was economic. So eventually we decided to go digital, and that's where we've been ever since. So we've had, I think we're on issue 7 now, and what's really emerged has been that, I think, the same feel that we had under that canopy that day, which is that breadth, and people coming to it not necessarily as psychologists, people coming to it as artists and people who are interested in psychology. Some people are therapists, but actually a lot of them, are doing a lot of different things at once, and that's always lovely as well. You get somebody who's an academic, but also an artist. So in the last piece, we had a piece which was very much about this person's personal relationship with plants and the small things, because it was the theme was the other than human, and it was beautifully written, but also she'd illustrated the piece as well herself, and so we get that kind of in a sense, I would say, adventurous contributions. They tend not to be the sort of strict academic or strict piece of art or strict bit of poetry. That there tends to be a mix and match approach to that. So yeah, so that's where it emerged from. So Unpsychology literally came from uncivilization plus psychology, I suppose, and we like the way it's kind of emerged since that time. Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting kind of history. I am struck with your focus on psychology, but not from psychologists. Or you said something to that matter, and you alluded to some different kinds of writing that inform the Unpsychology magazine. Are there any other stellar pieces of articles or themes that have jumped out that you have found really kind of illuminating?
What you mean that we've published? Yeah. Every time we put out a submissions call, we get some really interesting stuff, and we get. I mean, if I take the last edition for an example, we decided to go for the other than human last time. And the timing was quite interesting, because if we'd put out the core 6 months later, I think the other than human theme would have had a very different feel to it, you know, given that the magazine was published around March last year, and the pandemic was just taking off. So I imagine we kind of, it would have been really interesting to see what had emerged had we had a couple of months leeway on that one. But you know, that's a really good example, because what we got was some really beautiful short pieces around people's relationship with the other than human. You know, talking about their relationship with their horse as a child, or with wild horses or coyotes, small things, plants. You know, so there's quite a bit of that, and there was a lot of poetry, but there was a lot of poetic writing, and quite personal writing, and it didn't surprise me, because I think that's what emerges often. But it was a really, really pleasant thing to read, because it gave the magazine a texture which perhaps it wouldn't have had if it had been a little bit more academic, for example. And what we always hope is that we're going to get 2 or 3 longer pieces, you know, longer substantial essays from people, which will actually give some scaffolding to it. But then within you know, through the, if you like, in between all of that stuff, we flows the poetry and the art and all of that sort of thing. So it's difficult to pick out specific ones, and we've got some regular writers, people who've been contributing to Unpsychology for 2 or 3 issues now. So Toby Chown, Peggy Ayers is one. She's contributed a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, and a number of the people, Zia Woodbury, and some others as well, names some of you might recognize. But also, you know, what I think we'd like to do is just to get somebody we've never seen before, who just pops up and comes up. In the last edition, there was a wonderful poet, I'm trying to remember her surname, Rachel, and I'd met her at a retreat, and we talked, and a writing retreat which I was running with a colleague, and she was really good, and I just really loved her writing at the retreat. And so when she emailed me this email and said, "This is the sort of thing I'm writing," and the email itself was just a work of art. The email was a work of art, because it just had in it all the poems, but also this beautiful knitting together, this commentary that she gave it. And so we published it all. I mean, we obviously edited a little bit. We just published the whole thing, because it was just such a beautiful cycle of work that she produced. And I think that was the first time she'd been published. and we do that as much as we possibly can. You know, we try and, so we do get established poets and writers who will look, you know, obviously there's especially in the poetry world, there's a you know, there's a bunch of people out there who are kind of looking for journals to submit to, and that and so they do, and quite often we will publish their work. But I think for me the joy is always in finding somebody who I've never heard of, or they've never published before. That's just a lovely feeling. And often they have something to say. You know, they're saying something which is, again, what I said before about having a breadth to voices. You know, that to me, it feels quite important. And especially now, you know, we're talking about a climate breakdown and all the issues that we're facing, and we need different strategies. We don't just need the strategies that we're used to. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you for providing a platform for many different voices to be expressed and heard across lots of different media. So thank you for that, Steve, for that work. Just switching gears here a bit, though, I'm wondering about your view on the link or synergy between unpsychology and ecopsychology.
I think that the ecopsychology world is one that leans most towards unpsychology and vice versa. And I think that the people who are involved in this network and this community that you're here, I mean, you know, faces I've seen before and people I've worked with, you know, there is a kind of a natural affinity, I think, in terms of the way in which we think about the world. And so there's a lot of eco-psychologists kind of will come and produce work for us. I think it's in the expectations that we have of the world. You know, there's something about the way in which most people who I know in the eco-psychology world are looking for ways of knitting things together. You know, ways of knitting the ecological world with the social world, and you know, particularly at the moment where there's so much going on and so much distress and destruction and uncertainty. You know, we need that to be. I think we need that knitting, that weaving, in a way which, at other times, we have the luxury of kind of different schools of thought, if I can put it that way. You know, we can say, oh, well, let's look at this in more detail. And that's what I've liked about working with Nora Bateson's work, in the sense that what I found there was a kind of a language which felt familiar but new to me, almost. You know, there's something, and it doesn't necessarily depend on a spiritual set of assumptions or a spiritual set of beliefs. It doesn't, you know, it just takes that basic principle of interdependence and interconnection for granted. And I think that was really fresh for me to kind of come across that and have those conversations. So I mean, in some ways, I'd like Unpsychology to be kind of leaning into that community as well as into the eco-psychology community. And you know, I don't know whether that's a place where these different sort of integral communities can start to meet a little bit and have conversations.
Can you just briefly explain Nora's work with the warm data?
Stuff. Okay, so Nora Bateson is Gregory Bateson's daughter, and he was the guy who wrote Towards Ecology of Mind as the book, and he was involved in the kind of growth of cybernetics and systems work and complexity work in the 60s and 70s. And I think that's kind of, I think Nora's work is taking that work and bringing it into now, and to say, what's the 21st century contexts that we're facing, and how do we, and what kind of language can we keep from that early systems work, and what kind of new language do we need to conjure up, if you like. She's got lovely, some really, she actually makes up phrases which so if she feels there's not a word for something, she'll make it up, not in a kind of a way of saying, hey, look at me, but actually she will genuinely try and find something which really meets it. So there's a word called somathecy which she's come up with, which and I'm not sure of the etymology of it. I'm not particularly good at that myself, but there is some etymology behind it. But the somathecy is about learning in context, interdependent learning in context. So it's about what it is we're doing now is a somathecy, what it is that we do when we meet a forest or a tree or we're with we're with the other than humans, and that meeting is a somathecy. The kind of growth that might take place in an ecosystem is a somathecy. So that kind of concept is about learning and growth and development and being together. And the other one she uses is transcontextual, which I think was Gregory's word initially, but she uses it, and she frames that as being, we need to see things as sitting within frames within frames within frames within frames, so that each layer of context is in itself linked to all the other layers. So what it's about is taking away the linear determinism in things, so that when we look at a problem in the world, the cultural way of looking at it is to say we have a problem here, and we're going to solve it by having a direct corrective. And what she's saying is that it's not quite as simple as that. We need to go into the soil, and she means that literally, but also as a metaphor as well. That we need to go into the thing that is contextualizing all the problems, all the issues. So it becomes a kind of a and when I think of her work, I always think of the warm data. So she contrasts warm data with, in a sense, cold data, I suppose, which is the data of science. And she doesn't say it's not an either or, it's a both and or all and. And so we need the data of science, and her dad was a scientist, but we also need the things that trickles through, which is relational. And so the warm data is the relational stuff that trickles through the cracks between things. And that's for me, that's always the image that comes to mind when I'm thinking about Nora's work, is this sort of stuff just trickling through and kind of making whatever it is whole, the system whole in some way. And she's been, that work has really grown this year, and it's been helped by lockdown actually, because she was training people in warm data, and she was basically traveling the world doing that training, as a lot of people do with their training. And ended up, in fact, I met her just before, first time I'd ever met her was at Hawkwood College in Stroud in March, just before lockdown. And she escaped on the train and got back to Sweden just before they locked down. So it was kind of weird. But then what happened was she decided, with some of the people who'd been involved, she decided to offer these courses online. And so very much like this, we were in Zoom rooms, and I think over the last 12 months, she's about 500 people have trained in this particular work. So it'd be interesting to see how that moves into the future, and how that, going back to your question earlier on, Carol, about how does that come together with ecopsychology, and what can change in both fields, if you like, what needs to change in both fields or all fields to kind of meet and do that work.
Thank you for that description on because that's a new concept that's starting to float around. So I just have one last question here, Steve, from actually a participant who registered and wrote this in. How do you believe environmental deterioration triggers mental issues?
Wow, that's a biggie, isn't it? It's actually it's where maybe a slightly different worded version of it, but it's kind of where I came in, I think, in terms of wondering about that question, or a question about how is it that we are affected by that ecological degradation and destruction. I suppose the first thing I'd say is that is what that's why Nora's work was so resonant for me, because it felt like context is the thing that really needs to be taken in, which is basically what ecopsychology is about. You know, ecopsychology is about context. It's about the context of the of the ecological self, I suppose. And it felt to me that when in the UK, at least, when we looked at psychological problems, we were looking in straight lines. We were looking at straight lines from childhood to adulthood, from, you know, we're explaining it with one dimension, whatever that dimension might be. And in the UK particularly, if you look at the adverts at the back of the professional journals, it's all about, you know, how do we remove trauma, or how do we deal with this, or how do we you know, and there's different phases there. At the moment, trauma is really big. Trauma work's really big, and before it might have been something else, but it was all very much about removing the symptoms. And so for me, that was a way in. And there's kind of three levels. I suppose the answer to the question for me would be three levels. There's the level of awareness for all of us, that you know, that there's something going on in the world which we're all aware of, and yet we have various psychological approaches too. You know, often, you know, in the case of many people, denial, you know, or moving away from it, or minimization. And I think that for that particular strand of dysfunction, if you like, or distress, I think the COVID crisis has kind of brought it to the surface. So it's almost like it's almost like a kind of a geological layer, you know, that's there in our human psyche, but people kind of try and keep below the surface. But with COVID, that broader environmental context is just not able to kind of be pushed down anymore. So that's the first layer. The second layer would be something about, the second issue would be about Jerome Bernstein's work on borderliners, or the borderlanders, he would call them. And what I was noticing sometimes quite often in my therapy work was I would be working with somebody whose sensitivity to the world was just really they were struggling with. So they would often come with something which was a relationship issue, or something to do with, you know, abuse, or some kind of trauma in the past. But often what came into the present was the awareness of them, of the world, and how that really hurt them so directly. So, you know, I remember one young woman coming to see me, and there was something had been in the news about the tar sands in Alberta, I think it was, and she was absolutely distraught, and she could feel it directly. This was not about reading the news and being a bit upset about it. This was about this was personal. She felt this thing personally. She felt that kind of wound in the earth personally. I'm kind of reminded there's a passage that James Hillman writes about the red wound in the earth. You know, and it felt so visceral for her. And since that, and then I worked with some XR rebellion people since that time. And not often, but sometimes they have a similar kind of feel to it. You know, there's the sensitivity to what they're doing, and the sensitivity to what they're fighting for and campaigning for really hurts. You know, it's they can't not do this work. They can, and they don't think they're doing enough. So there's all sorts of layers of things like guilt and everything going on there as well. So those two layers were there in, I guess, when Unpsychology was set up, and when I was starting to think about this stuff. And the other layer, which I guess was also beginning to be there, and it probably was there in other parts of the world more than it was in the UK, but it's definitely emerging, is the direct effects of the traumas that are coming along, like floods and fires. You know, if the floods in the UK over the last 5 years have really increased, last 10 years have really increased. And that's not going away. And I remember on my psychiatric placement going on a visit to see this. In fact, this is one of the stories that triggered off the Unpsychology event that I did. Going to see this woman, and she was she'd been placed in social housing, and the reason for that was because her home had been destroyed in a flood, and she'd lived in what I guess in North America might be called a trailer park type place beside the river. But for her, it was it was almost like a dream house. She'd got together with this guy, and they'd got this caravan by the river, and she'd made it beautiful, and she'd decorated it and all of that stuff, and then it was gone. And it was, I mean, the story was distressing in itself. And I met this woman, and she was sitting in a corner of a bare room, because she'd been put in this social housing, this bare room, on a chair, rocking, just like that, catatonic. She couldn't speak, wasn't speaking. And she would be visited every day by different mental health workers, which I thought was awful and counterintuitive. And when I was walking back to the clinic where I was based, and I was walking back with the psychiatrist, and he was telling me about what treatment she was getting, and there was drugs, and there was antidepressants and antipsychotic stuff and all that sort of thing. So we were walking along, and I was asking about this because that was what I was there to do, to find out about what was that kind of end of the profession. And he looked at me and he told me about the drugs she was going to be taking, or was taking. She said, but it won't work. And I thought, wow. And I looked at him, and he said, well, it won't work because she's, it's grief. It's grief, it's trauma. She's suffered a massive loss. And then we had a bit of a conversation, which was a more surface conversation about what could that mean in a different kind of society? What would that look like if the village or the tribe was to rally around somebody like her? I think I brought that theme. I don't think he quite got it, but that was the question in my mind really at that time, is what would it be like if in another kind of cultural environment, how would we respond to her? Would we just chuck her in an empty room and put drugs in her until there was a place in a psychiatric ward, or would we do something else? And that was kind of a key story, a key experience for me in terms of investigating some of this stuff.
Fascinating. Super. Thank you for sharing that, Steve, and for this conversation. I'm going to end our recording now, and we can talk to our people online here.